So today we will start our 2-week sessions on Islam, and I have to say at the outset, I was putting this talk together yesterday morning after I had been going online and looking at some of the news reports regarding what had happened in Paris, and was as horrified and shocked as I'm sure everyone was at getting the details of those attacks. And but I got frustrated as I was doing that, because I thought, well, this is gonna shape what I say on Sunday, and I didn't want it to do that. Because my study of Islam has convinced me that the terrorism that took place over the last few days in Paris has nothing more to do with Islam than the actions of the Christian Crusaders had anything to do with the worship of the Prince of Peace. So, as far as I'm concerned, at this point anyway, the less said about that, the better. I will have a few thoughts on Islam and violence just toward the end of the presentation, because it is one of those things that divides the Muslim community around the world today. But that's not intrinsic to this presentation, because I don't see ISIS as representative of the Islamic religion, not as it's been developed in its purest form. And that's coming from an outsider's perspective. As a non-Muslim, this is my perspective, and I just wanted to put that out there. All right, so what we have here is an Abrahamic faith in its essence, and the reason for that is for a number of reasons. Certainly Muslims recognize the revelations found in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. They see those as messages from God. They see those texts as somewhat distorted, however. And so one of the things that Islam does is it tries to correct for misperceptions as they are found in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But Abraham is unquestionably a patriarch for the Muslim people, just as he is for Jews and Christians. And in many respects, all the biblical heroes, going all the way back to Adam, Noah, Joseph, Moses, and Jesus, who's also regarded as a prophet for Muslims, these are all pivotal figures in the Muslim faith. And so in that sense, we share a lineage of patriarchs. And as we will see, Muslim monotheism is just as uncompromising, in some respects more uncompromising and more consistent even than Jewish or Christian monotheism. In fact, I was struck as Rabbi Miller was talking last week about Judaism and how Jews are so iconoclastic, right? They don't worship idols. God cannot be represented with a graven image, and Muslims are absolutely convinced of that, even to the point in which artistic representations of Muhammad were usually done with something covering his face, lest Muslims fall into the trap of idolizing Muhammad, seeing him as somehow divine, because only God is divine. So there's a lot of things that we have in common. The differences are, number one, that Muhammad is regarded as the culmination of God's revelation. So believing that Muhammad is God's prophet and that he offers the fullest vision of God's truth is what differentiates Muslims from non-Muslims. In addition, Islam is truly a global faith in the sense that, unlike Judaism, it's not predicated on an ethnic affiliation. There was a bit of a preference early in Islam for Arabic people who were seen as being somehow closer to God than non-Arab peoples, but that was pretty much eliminated by about the 9th century, where both Arab and non-Arab Muslims were viewed as equals in the Islamic faith. And unlike Christianity, Islam does not presuppose a savior. So each of us individually will come before God answering for our good deeds and bad deeds, and we will be judged accordingly. In terms of the background context to the development of Islam, we really start in Arabia in the 6th century. Islam is the product of intersections, really, between a Bedouin civilization of pastoral nomads who would trade. In fact, Muhammad himself comes from the Quraysh tribe, one of the more important merchant tribes in Arabia. Clan violence was commonplace, and the power of the clan invested in the sheikh, or the clan leader, was really the dominant political system at the time, so there was no overarching political authority. So a diverse array of clans was pretty much the political context here. A very polytheistic culture, with clan deities really being the focal point. So each clan had its own patron god that it would worship. This sometimes exacerbated violence and tension between clans because they all worshipped different gods. They did have a few things in common, including the Kaaba, which is the sacred stone, possibly originated as a meteorite in Mecca, and this was housed in a granite chamber, a square granite chamber, and Arabs from all over Arabia would go there on pilgrimage to Mecca because their individual clan idols were housed there. This was seen as a bit of a common meeting point for Arabs as they would go to Mecca, and it was seen that Abraham himself, or believed that Abraham himself had created it. So another example of the Abrahamic roots of the tradition. Because Mecca and other cities on the west coast of Arabia were so important for trade, a lot of caravans would be going through there. A lot of trade with the Middle East would be going through there. It gave a cosmopolitan flavor to places like Mecca. And so really what you have there is a diversity of cultural traditions that are intersecting. There were Jews present, Christians present, other pagan polytheists of Arabic descent would be there. And this is important because it lends, that's the context in which Muhammad himself comes of age. He's familiar with their doctrines. He knows these kinds of folks. And so in some ways, you can see that there's some Jewish and Christian roots there that help shape some of the core Muslim insights because these were pretty cosmopolitan places. All right, so a little bit about Muhammad's life and the path that he takes to becoming a prophet. He was orphaned from the age of 6 years old. He was born in 571. He is a caravan trader, like the rest of his family. As I mentioned, the Quraysh tribe was an important tribe. It was, in fact, the dominant tribe in Mecca in the 6th century. His experience as an orphan seems to have shaped a lot of his convictions about social justice. To be an orphan in Arabia in the 6th century was a pretty unfortunate fate. It was, especially in a nomadic world, to be a widow or an orphan or to be poor meant that you had a very difficult existence ahead of you. And it may be that losing his parents at an early age really helped shape his convictions regarding the welfare of the oppressed. He was adopted virtually by his uncle, and then became a caravan trader like the rest of his clan. He would frequently go into the hills to meditate and to pray. So he was a very devout individual. And according to Muslim tradition, he spurned the polytheism of the Arab people from an early age. There was again some experience with monotheism in the cultural context of the 6th century, so he would have known Jews and Christians. And there were, even among the Arab people, some monotheists who kind of rallied around the idea of the one God, Allah. So that was not a completely new idea when Muhammad introduced it. And it seems likely that one of the reasons why he lamented the polytheism was precisely because of the way that it exacerbated the conflicts among clans. So in the midst of one of his experiences of praying in seclusion, when he would go for sometimes as much as a month at a time in prayer, he experiences a very uncanny moment of revelation. And he describes it here. This is in text number 1. Okay, this is on page 6. And this is from one of the hadith of Muhammad. The hadith are sayings attributed to Muhammad or stories attributed to Muhammad, usually passed down from eyewitness observers. And the story goes as follows. The apostle would pray in seclusion on Mount Hira each year for a month to practice religious exercises, as was the custom of the night on which God honored him with his mission and showed mercy on his servants thereby. Gabriel brought him the command of God. He came to me, said the apostle, while I was asleep, with a piece of brocade whereon was writing, and said, recite. And I said, what shall I recite? He pressed me with it so tightly that I thought it was death. Then he let me go and said, recite. I said, what shall I recite? He pressed me with it again so that I thought it was death. Then he let me go and said, recite. I said, but what shall I read? And this I said only to deliver myself from him, lest he should do the same to me again. But he said, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from blood clotted. Thy Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught that which they knew not unto men. So I recited it, and he departed from me. And I awoke from my sleep, and it was as though these words were written on my heart. It's kind of striking the way that he describes this event. It's frightening to him. He worries at first that he might be possessed by a demon. He also worries that perhaps he's losing his mind. This was not something that he was hoping to receive during his meditations in the mountains. But he eventually becomes convinced that, in fact, this is indeed the angel Gabriel, and that God is speaking to him directly, and that he needs to remember these recitations. And that becomes the basis of the Quran. Okay. So let's see. At this time, he is married to Khadijah, a wealthy widow who she's 40 years old, and he was 25 at the time. She herself is a caravan trader. And the reason why I bring up Khadijah is because much as Muhammad's life becomes exemplary for Muslims, so too does Khadijah's life become exemplary for Muslim women. She is his confidant, someone, really I think the best way to describe her is as a soulmate for Muhammad. The stories of Muhammad and Khadijah are striking in the power of the love between them. And in fact, Khadijah plays a very important role after Muhammad starts to receive these revelations. She helps convince him that in fact he should take this seriously. And that perhaps God has chosen him for something very important. So she does play a very important role in shaping his call as a prophet. It was also almost unheard of in the Bedouin culture of the 6th century Arabia for someone to marry an older woman in this fashion. So it says a lot about Khadijah, but it also says a lot about Muhammad and his courage, really, in taking on this responsibility. Okay, so his revelations begin when he's around 40 years old. And these take place over several years. And because Muhammad is illiterate, this is in fact why the Quran is seen as the miracle of Islam. Because he had to remember the revelations that were given to him. They were not written down until later on by some of his disciples. And so they were preserved through oral transmission. It is comprised of 114 surahs, varying length. All told, the Quran is about 4/5 the size of the New Testament. It can be recited, and in fact, in Iran, for instance, they have great respect given to those who can memorize and recite the Quran word for word in Arabic. It takes about 24 hours to do. It's quite impressive. You can actually YouTube this if you want to see examples of it. 24 hours long. You can see the Quran being recited verbatim. And it is in Arabic, principally because it is considered the word-for-word truth from God himself. It's not considered inspired in the way that Hebrew writings or the New Testament writings are. It is considered a direct dictation from God, and therefore Arabic is seen as the proper language in which it is to be learned. And it's remarkably detailed in the sense that it not only concerns the way in which God is to be worshipped, it not only concerns the way in which the poor are to be treated, and a lot of emphasis on justice and righteousness, but it also has very detailed instructions just on day-to-day living. And this is important because Islam is supposed to be a way of life. It is supposed to be comprehensive in every facet of life, being part of one's righteous obligations as a Muslim. So we can get a couple examples of the Quran here. Text number 2, this is on page 7. And A lot of the surahs, a lot of the chapters start in this fashion. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. Muslims, in their desire not to fall prey to idolatry, are adamant that we can only use adjectives, really, to describe God. Again, as the rabbi was talking last week about how you can best feel confident describing God in the negative, right? What God is not is much safer in some ways than saying what He is, because you risk idolatry as soon as you put God in a box, and reduce Him in that way. The way that the Quran tends to do this is by using a lot of different adjectives. The adjectives are constantly shifting, and that prevents us from getting too reified an image of who God is, and not recognizing that God is so far beyond our comprehension that we can never really pin Him down with precision. But this is one of the dominant phrases used. The name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. By the light of day and by the fall of night, your Lord has not forsaken you, nor does He abhor you. The life to come holds a richer prize for you than this present life. You shall be gratified with what your Lord will give you. Did He not find you an orphan and give you shelter? Did He not find you in error and guide you? Did He not find you poor and enrich you? Therefore do not wrong the orphan, nor chide away the beggar, but proclaim the goodness of your Lord. Standard themes that we find in a lot of the surahs: an emphasis on social justice, an emphasis on helping the poor, an emphasis on taking pity on those who've been excluded from the society. Again, you can see a parallel here with Muhammad's own upbringing and his sensitivity to these issues. Another example, text number 3. Those that suppress any part of the scriptures which Allah has revealed in order to gain some paltry end shall swallow nothing but fire into their bellies. On the day of resurrection, Allah will neither speak to them nor purify them. There shall be a woeful punishment. Such are those that barter guidance for error and forgiveness for punishment. How steadfastly they seek the fire of hell. That is because Allah has revealed the book with the truth. Those that disagree about it are in schism. Righteousness does not consist in whether you face towards the east or the west. The righteous man is he who believes in Allah and the last day, in the angels and the scriptures and the prophets, who for the love of Allah gives his wealth to his kinfolk, to the orphans, to the needy, to the wayfarers and to the beggars, and for the redemption of captives, who attends to his prayers and pays the alms tax, who is true to his promises and steadfast in trial and adversity and in times of war. Such are the true believers, such are the God-fearing. There's a lot of emphasis in the Quran on details of daily living and getting things right, but always these are qualified with the demand that justice be done to those who are oppressed, that the poor be taken care of. And so righteousness is ultimately measured in the end by faithfulness that is demonstrated in works. This is a strong abiding emphasis throughout the Quran. You get a few examples of it there. Okay. Once Muhammad receives the revelation, he is then convinced that as a prophet, he needs to spread God's truth throughout Arabia. And so he starts proclaiming these truths in Mecca, starts to build a following, and that's where he starts to receive some pushback from the Meccan authorities. A lot of those authorities had a vested interest in maintaining the system of idols that was enshrined in the Kaaba, because Mecca's status as a merchant city was in some ways predicated on its being a site of pilgrimage. And so when Muhammad starts proclaiming this message about monotheism, they of course see that as an immediate threat. So things start to heat up, and as a result, in order to avoid a civil war, Muhammad and his followers flee to Yathrib, henceforth known as Medina. That happens in 622 CE. And that's an important year, because that is seen as the first year on the Muslim calendar, the Hijra, or the flight to Medina.
Is that how it's pronounced? Hijra?
Hijra, yes. And that's the place in which the Muslim community is transformed, the Ummah, as it is called. And they're there for some time. They're there until 630, when Muhammad and his forces make a triumphant return to Mecca, and they conquer it, largely without bloodshed. The city surrenders by that point voluntarily. Some interesting things happen, though, while they're in Medina. For one thing, Muhammad comes to be revered, not just by his Muslim followers, but also by Jews and Christians who were there in that community. He comes to earn his reputation as a just, prudent, and fair lawgiver in that stage. In fact, the reason why they go to Medina to begin with is because they're invited to go there. Muhammad's reputation had already been pretty well established as an arbiter, someone who was fair and just, and there were some interreligious tensions that were there in Medina, and Muhammad came in and helped them resolve them. So he was earning the respect not just of his Muslim followers, but also other religious groups who he had worked with in Medina. But in the 8 years that they're there, he essentially builds his base of followers. They have a pretty formidable army that has already had some skirmishes with Meccan forces before then. And so they have an overwhelming number of soldiers who eventually make the return to Mecca in 630, and the city surrenders without a fight. They have mercy on the Meccan adversaries who had previously tormented them, but they are absolutely uncompromising in going into the Kaaba and destroying all the idols there. This is a monotheistic movement, and so Muhammad was adamant that the Kaaba had to be purified of all the polytheistic idolatry that it had housed for all the centuries, essentially.
Troy?
Yes?
Why did they feel the need to go and conquer Mecca? Do you know, was there...
Well, Mecca was the dominant city, religiously speaking, for Arabs in the 6th and 7th century. So because of the role that the Kaaba had played culturally, there was no question that would have been the religious capital of the Arab people. And so because he's convinced now that God is one and that Allah alone is to be worshipped, therefore there's an imperative built within the religion to challenge idolatry wherever it's found. And the logical place to begin was Mecca.
Wasn't there also a precipitating conflict about pilgrims going through and being mistreated
Right.
as well?
Right, absolutely. And it seems as though from an early age, Muhammad was convinced that the divisions among the Arab people were not only problematic and unjust, but against the will of God. And so there's a strong thrust in Arab monotheism and Islamic monotheism toward the creation of unity. Right, the divisions are inherently problematic, and that they have to be fought against. Yeah, and there is a concern of justice here as well. So that's why Mecca becomes the heart of the movement then, and with the Kaaba remaining important, but now it has been purged of idolatrous polytheism, and now it becomes a beacon for the right worship of the one true God.
Is there an economic interest too? I mean, in other words, because the trade was going through there, Mecca was more important from an economic point of view than Medina.
I think that's true. Yes, that the Meccan authorities certainly were defensive about this and concerned that their economic bottom line was going to be jeopardized. Yeah, no question. Yeah, the two communities were very different. Medina was more of an agriculturalist settlement than Mecca was, and the fact that the Quraysh tribe had always been linked very closely to caravan trading and mercantile activity may be a reason why Muhammad felt more at home having Mecca be his capital rather than Medina. But I think the role of the Kaaba also has to be considered here, that because that had become such a central shrine for the Arab people, his statement about the oneness of God would be reinforced by turning the Kaaba into a focal point for Muslim worship rather than the pagan polytheism. Okay, so with that in place, you then have all the rudiments of the Muslim faith that are pretty well established. I do have to say a little bit here about what happens right after the conquest of Mecca, and that is a pretty amazing expansion of the Muslim faith throughout all of Arabia. That happens remarkably quickly. By the time of Muhammad's death, practically all of Arabia had been united under Muslim rule, and another 50 years after that, the expansion well beyond the Middle East has already taken place into Africa. Jerusalem had been conquered certainly within a couple of decades. And so really by the end of the 7th century, Islam had already been established as a formidable empire throughout the Middle East. And why this happens is in fact part of, I think, well, in some respects, a continuation of what Muhammad sees his role as being. First and foremost, uniting the Arab peoples was absolutely imperative. He felt that polytheism in particular was idolatry to the extreme, and that God hated idolatry in that fashion, and that it needed to be eliminated. So there is, and in the first maybe 100 years or so of Islam, there definitely seems to be a preference given for Arab Muslims, the sense in which this is a religion about the Arab people first and foremost. But the fact that it quickly spread beyond Arabia indicates that Muslims definitely saw their task as eliminating idolatry wherever they found it. It should be said that by idolatry they do not include Jews and Christians, and in fact, all the evidence we have suggests that Muhammad and the early Muslims had a pretty deep regard for Jews and Christians as being peoples of the book, as they called them. Muhammad, being illiterate himself, seemed to have a lot of respect for the traditions that relied on written revelation as the way that they understood God. The pagan polytheists in Arabia didn't have any kind of written revelation. Their traditions were all handed down orally, and they were all based around each individual clan and their particular practices. So Muhammad had deep respect for Jews and Christians, and through the vast period of Islamic rule over Jews and Christians in the Middle East and beyond, generally Jews and Christians were left alone and respected as long as they acknowledged that they were living under Muslim rule. So they didn't have public recognition in the sense that churches and synagogues would be established with government support, of course. But generally, because Muslims recognize that they come out of the Jewish and Christian tradition, that those traditions helped shape their own views of the one God, that monotheistic connection as well as the connection of revelation was very important. The main goal to conquest is to ensure that the Muslim faithful are able to have Muslim rulers who will help them remain righteous. That's the central concern here. It's another myth that as Islam expanded throughout the world, that they were converting people at sword point. Because generally speaking, Muslim leaders didn't really care all that much what most folks believed. They certainly cared what Muslim faithful believed, and they saw their primary responsibilities to them. Jews and Christians, again, were generally left alone, and peasants and commoners were generally left alone. Their main concern was to see if they could persuade the ruling elite to join the Muslim faithful, because that would allow them easier access to governing their empire by taking advantage of local rulers who they could then bring into the Islamic fold. But this was not an expansion of an empire designed to convert everybody to Islam, because the emphasis on Islam, of course, is submission, and the idea is that each believer has to do that on their own. That cannot be coerced. Yes.
You want to question something?
Oh no, you can feel free. Yes.
When
Absolutely.
did Persia get involved? When did the spread start moving or not?
Well, that happens actually pretty early on here. Yeah, the Persian Empire was kind of brought into the Muslim fold.
Persia had been part of the Eastern Roman Empire, hadn't it? Or after?
Trying to remember.
Did that stop at the Tigris Euphrates?
It's a good question. I'm not exactly sure in the 7th century whether. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, eventually they are going to be brought in, but I don't know if that happens quite as early yet as the 7th century. Yeah. All right, so a little bit just about the details, the fundamentals of the faith. All right, and we start with the 5 pillars. One of the reasons why that scholars have speculated that Islam was able to spread so quickly was because of the simplicity of the faith. There really are the 5 pillars that all Muslims are united around. The first, of course, being the confession, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. This is the fundamental truth that separates Muslims from other monotheistic traditions, as I mentioned earlier. The emphasis on worship, which for individuals means 5 times a day, daily prayer. And then mosque worship that would take place on Fridays, that's the holy day in the Islamic week. Almsgiving, which was initially provided as a tax. So when you lived under a Muslim government, that government would be responsible for taxing you in order to make sure that the poor were taken care of. term has broadened over the years. Muslims who do not live in a Muslim state would have this administered through the local mosque. Almsgiving can also be seen as any charitable act, for instance, funds provided to build a hospital or a school, any kind of generosity toward others is filed under almsgiving. The fast, which is to happen during the month of Ramadan, that's from dusk, or from dawn to dusk, and that's the month in which the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, or the beginnings of his revelations. And that's because Islam uses the lunar calendar, Ramadan always, it's a different time each year. And then you have the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is encouraged for all Muslims. It's become increasingly difficult to perform this as the number of Muslims around the world have increased. There's only so many folks that they can accommodate each year with these celebrations in Mecca. And so what a lot of Muslim countries have to do, Indonesia for instance, which is still the most popular country of Muslims, they have to have a lottery system in order to ration the number of folks who can actually make the trip. In cases of where resources do not permit or poor health does not permit the pilgrimage, it's not considered absolutely mandatory. Yes, sir.
What exactly do they mean by prophet? Is it somebody that tells the future? Is it somebody that provides intercession? Is it somebody that does the interpretation? There's all different concepts of prophet.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. What do Muslims mean by calling Muhammad the prophet? I think in this case it's twofold. I think they see, in keeping with the biblical tradition of the prophet being someone who speaks out on behalf of the oppressed. The biblical prophets are always chiding God's people for not being attentive enough to those in need. And they're especially attuned to any injustice in the community, and that God's judgment will come down very heavily on those who don't just not do enough to combat injustice, but actually contribute to it themselves. So he's as somebody who speaks out on behalf of the oppressed, they absolutely see Muhammad as a prophetic figure in that sense. And there they have a lineage going back to the Hebrew prophets. Jesus is seen as a prophet in the same light, as speaking out on behalf of the vulnerable and the oppressed. But most fundamentally, he's a prophet in the sense that he reveals the fullness of God's revelation. That the Hebrew prophets had gotten a lot of it right, that Jesus had gotten a lot of it right, but that distortions nevertheless found their way into the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and that Muhammad's revelation was complete, faultless, without error, precisely because it was dictated directly to him from God. So there's no intermediaries there that can mess up the message. It is pure, it is as complete as it could be, and therefore he's viewed as the last of the prophets. Now that said, the community is evolving over the first couple centuries of Islam, of course, and we'll say more about that in a second here when we get to Sharia. In fact, maybe I'll go right into this. It's not just the Quran that is normative for Muslims. Anything having to do with Muhammad himself is considered obligatory for Muslims. His life is the exemplary life of a faithful Muslim. And for some Muslims, he's viewed as sinless. That is, that he's lives a blemish-free existence and therefore is pure. That's debated. And the term sin is actually a problematic one in Islam. This is a complicated thing. But in any event, he's most certainly not seen as divine, right? Muslims have to be absolutely clear about this. That's why depictions of Muhammad are so problematic for Muslims, because to depict Muhammad, someone who is so righteous and someone who is chosen as an exemplary figure, risks idolatry. But anything that Muhammad said, anything that he did, anything that could be documented, becomes part of Sharia. And Sharia stands co-equal with the Quran as normative for Muslim believers. So if it's something that he says, something that's overheard in conversation, such as the very first text that we looked at, that's part of the Hadith. And if it's something that he did and was established as accepted practice, for instance, the way in which Muhammad prays is now normative for Muslims to pray. Right? So the stories of Muhammad bowing prostrate to Mecca then become the Sunnah. So with the Sunnah and the Hadith, you have Sharia, and that is, alongside the Quran, essentially the standard for Muslim living. How it's interpreted varies widely from Muslim community to Muslim community, and it's one of the things that divides Muslims to this day, is exactly how Sharia should be interpreted and to what extent it should be used to guide the life of Muslim believers. And so this is why you have pretty significant differences between Muslims living in the United States, say, right, living under non-Muslim rule, and Muslims who are living in the Middle East in societies governed by Muslims. Because the extent of Sharia law is going to vary widely depending on the laws of the country you find yourselves in, right? I mean, in some ways, it's not that dissimilar from what we talked about when we looked at Judaism and the experience of Jews living in diaspora, although Muslims don't consider themselves living in diaspora. So there's some differences, but in terms of the challenges of how you assimilate or don't assimilate to the larger society you find yourselves in, that's increasingly becoming an issue for Muslim people worldwide.
Don't those very distinctions and interpretations then go head to head with text 3, which you showed us in the second paragraph, which ends, those that disagree about it are in schism?
Yeah. Well, and it helps explain why the controversies between branches of Islam have become so violent and destructive. One of the things I wanted to talk about was this very issue. Right? If you look at the civil war as it's transpiring in Iraq, and it is a civil war between Shiite and Sunni Muslims, the differences that they have are far more significant and far more destructive than the differences that they have with the West. If we're talking about Christian civilization or Jewish civilization, yeah, those internecine squabbles between Muslims, well, that's a nice euphemism, isn't it? I mean, well, precisely because the stakes are so high. And unlike Judaism, which seems to have some built-in impulses that allow for widespread diversity in belief and widespread diversity in practice, and you're still Jewish, right? Now, maybe part of this is because of the ethnic basis of the religion, right? One is a Jew if you're born of a Jewish mother. Because this is such a radically monotheistic tradition and such radical emphasis put on the figure of Muhammad and any teachings, sayings, practices that Muhammad provides, those subtle differences of interpretation can become huge in their significance.
But what do you mean by the stakes are so high? What are the stakes?
Well, why are the stakes so high? Yeah, Muhammad seems so convinced that he has received the direct revelation from God, that he seems convinced himself that he is without error in this matter, and that therefore to go against him becomes it's an act of blasphemy. It's going against God, and his followers seem pretty convinced of this as well. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of tolerance for difference of opinion there. There really doesn't. And now, that said, there are moments throughout Islam's history where you've actually had a fairly reasonable, in fact, a generous amount of tolerance for differences of opinion. And Muslim scholars will emphasize that, this is part of a discourse. This is part of an ongoing, evolving tradition. But mixed alongside that, you certainly have some startling moments where God's decrees are so self-evident and so plain that anyone who disagrees with them, it's not really a difference of opinion; it really is blasphemy. And sure, that concept of blasphemy in the Muslim tradition is taken really, really seriously by Muslims, and to fall into it and to endanger oneself by going down the path of idolatry is always a peril that one has to confront. And so, yeah, the stakes couldn't be higher in that sense. God's judgment is real, and it is uncompromising, and to fall into the hands of an angry God is a scary thing for Muslims. And as a ruler, one has a responsibility to make sure that one's people do not fall into idolatry. And yes, if the sword is needed to prevent that, the sword can be used as an option. And that was going to bring me to that point in text number 4 about violence. Islam is not a pacifist religion. It's not. And in some ways, now, I mean, one could argue that neither are Judaism and Christianity, right? I mean, Christians worship the Prince of Peace, and yet they've been entirely capable of committing all sorts of violence over the centuries. But unlike Christianity, where you're hard-pressed to find Jesus endorsing the use of violence, and in which case Christians become hypocritical, Muslims in their use of violence are not really hypocritical, because the Quran does say that violence can be, in fact, not just allowable, but imperative. We can take a look at text number 4 here. This is from Surah 2 in the Quran. Fight for the sake of Allah those that fight against you, but do not attack them first. Allah does not love the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them. Drive them out of the places from which they drove you. Idolatry is worse than carnage. But do not fight them within the precincts of the holy mosque unless they attack you there. If they attack you, put them to the sword. Thus shall the unbelievers be rewarded. But if they mend their ways, know that Allah is forgiving and merciful. Fight against them until idolatry is no more and Allah's religion reigns supreme. It is worth stressing that the primary targets of the idolatry here, or the primary practitioners of the idolatry, are the Bedouins, whom Muslims were fighting as they tried to unify Arabia around the principles of Islam. Right? That is the central target of Muhammad's ire in this case. And so that's what they mean by idolatry. They're not addressing people who are not Muslim. They are targeting Arab polytheists. And that's important, because it's not a call to arms against Christians or Jews, who again are given great respect by Muhammad and his followers as peoples of the book. But there is a sense in which, because Islam must be maintained in its purity, that differences of interpretation, differences of view on what Sharia requires can become a fighting matter. Because you can't let Muslims be led astray by false teaching. Father Bill.
In that, and I think that's right. I think what I would add to it is, Islam is more democratized in terms of who makes the judgment, particularly in the post-Caliphate era. There's no one single court of appeals that could say which version of Sharia is more faithful than another. And so what often is the case is the battle is not so much physical as rhetorical, where you have different imams who will issue fatwas and then sometimes rescind them depending on the time and the circumstances. So the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, for example, has expired, and now it's no longer, they're not as upset about that as they once were.
Right.
And the final thing that, the Surah 2, and there's another Surah 8 where they talk about conflict. There were movements within Islam, depending on the context, in which there was a whole movement called the abrogationists in the 8th century, for example, who argued that because they were directed during the early years of Islam's growth, that those passages of the Quran didn't apply in a straightforward way today as they did back then.
Right.
And then you have the non-abrogationists that come in and say, no, these things still apply, but they apply in very subtle ways. And so there's always going to be, there is a similar critique, but it's more like arguments about midrash, about interpretation or about Talmud, because they'll cite another authority to back up an argument. There isn't the same, although, I'm sorry to go on, but I mean, there are also jurists that will try to identify the principle at stake in a law, the fiqh, that's operating. So there's all sorts of things going on.
Troy, and I'm sorry,
Absolutely.
but
Yes.
I think the problem is the problem in all religions. When you become so exoteric and you literalize scripture. I mean, look at the end on text 4. The last sentence of the first stanza. Do not attack them first and then go down. Idolatry is worse than carnage. Those are logically inconsistent.
Yeah, but we've got Manish and I are got to leave, and I just did a data dump, and I apologize. It was not
No, I appreciate it.
And so, folks,
Yeah.
Troy's doing a masterful job. It's a very difficult thing, and so I apologize for jumping in like that.
Yeah. No, I would build on the point that Father Bill was making. Toward the end here, I allude to the differences between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. Now, that's the dominant conflict in the world we live in, right? But there are many Muslims beyond Sunni and Shiite Islam, right? For instance, if you look at Syria is currently ruled by Alawite Muslims, and they're a whole different animal with teachings that are regarded as absolutely heretical by other Muslims. So there's a great deal of diversity within the Muslim faith, and there has been historically. I wasn't able to say anything about Sufism, for instance, which is another amazingly interesting strand of Muslim thought. So, yeah, this is a sketch, unfortunately, and there's a lot more that we could do to go into greater depth here. But to say that, yes, I think just to return to what I said at the opening, as Christians, we have to be so careful. And I think part of our humility here has to be that we have to avoid rushing to judgment in quite the way that media outlets have often done when looking at things like what happened in Paris, right? Islam is as multifaceted and diverse as Christianity, as Judaism, as the other traditions that we've been looking at. And I think keeping that in mind behooves us as well as Muslims that we are in contact with and who we want to show the respect to.
We probably do need to stop, unfortunately, but I want to take a moment because this is the last lecture that Troy is giving in the course of this course, and I want to say how incredibly grateful I am for his leadership in this area and how much I have benefited from the work you've done on these lectures, and also that I don't want to go so far as to say that we got a twofer when we hired Nisha, but we really came pretty close without wanting to say anything. But Troy, we've been really, really blessed by your knowledge and by everything that you've brought to us. And next semester, after Christmas, to give a teaser, we'll be doing Christianity the First 3,000 Years by Darman McCullough. So it's a big book, but I plan on tapping on Troy again because his knowledge is so great. And those of you who are in the fitter category, if you could help move some chairs